My name is Lisa Herzog. I am now improvising to be chair of a session I didn't know I was going to chair, but thanks to help from our team, I hope I'll manage. We have 3 to 4 speakers, hopefully 4, still working on that. And I'll briefly introduce each of them before they give the presentation. We'll start with Charles Whalen, who's a research fellow at the Baldy Center for Law and Social Policy at the University of Buffalo, US. And his AFEE presidential address on reclaiming the right to work as progressive cause appeared last year in the Buffalo Legal Studies Research Paper Series in the Journal of Economic Issues and Challenge. So we are very happy to have you here. Charles, over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate it. Thanks for all the work behind the scenes. So my goal today is to make 3 points, and I'll draw on the case of the United States because that's what I know best. And I'll be a tight 15 minutes, maybe slightly over that. First, the notion of jobs for all who are willing and able to work is not new. The second point is that notion of jobs for all is deeply conservative. And third, jobs for all, or what long ago was called the right to work, is vital to fulfilling what many in the United States call the promise of America. So let's start with the fact that having government serve as employer of last resort is not new. Of course, in the United States, for most of the post-World War II era, the phrase the right to work has been used by anti-labor propagandists in calling for policies that hobble the ability of unions to represent workers. In fact, however, the right to work was originally a progressive aim that included the promise of jobs for all who are willing and able to work. In the 1890s, John R. Commons, one of the founders of the Institutional School of Economics, framed the idea of a right to work not as a radical break from the past, but as a logical extension of the right to life and liberty under the US Constitution. According to Commons, a core American notion of the 19th century was that a worker should have the opportunity to become an independent producer, that is, start a business, own one's own farm, rather than remain a wage laborer. However, at the end of the 19th century, Commons argued that changes to the economy that had occurred, including closing of the Western frontier, industrialization, and corporate concentration, all these had combined to put becoming an independent producer out of the reach of most employees. As a result, workers were at an extreme disadvantage relative to their employers. Even worse, they had less of an opportunity than in the past to claim a homestead out west and therefore start a farm. So Commons expressed this concern by saying that the jobless had lost any meaningful right to life and liberty. They couldn't really easily start their own business. It just took too much in this new era. And they couldn't just go out and start a farm because the land wasn't available like it had been. What Commons called the right to work was, in his view, an extension of what he called a bundle of rights that secure and give meaning to individual liberty under the Constitution. So the right to work was a solution designed in response to changing economic conditions, a solution that Commons called, he used these words, the next great human right. So the right to work in the 1890s, he called the next great human right. At the center of Commons' notion of the right to work was the idea that government would furnish work for the unemployed in the form, for example, of public works, especially in response to cyclical and structural unemployment. But government serving as employer of last resort was only one aspect of his envisioned bundle of rights. In Commons' view, the bundle of rights would also include government-provided training programs and other assistance to help people seeking to enter new lines of work as the economy continued to evolve. In addition, this bundle of rights would include, for example, protective regulations to prevent unjust discharges, and also government-sponsored unemployment insurance to compensate workers who are left jobless for at least in the initial short-term transitions. So this original progressive notion of the right to work came into the national spotlight in the United States during the Great Depression. In 1932, in a speech written by another institutionalist, Adolph Burl, presidential candidate Franklin Roosevelt echoed Commons' call for the right to work. including Cummins' justification for it, the justification that I just described about adjusting to a changing economy. Then, as president, Roosevelt incorporated the notion of jobs for all in 1941 into his vision of the four freedoms, and he explicitly mentioned the right to a useful and remunerative job in 1944 as part of his second Bill of Rights. So from there we get to today's right to the decent work that we have on our program. In a watered-down form, the idea of a right to a job led to the Employment Act of 1946, and then in 1978 to the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act. While neither of those include a job guarantee, both offered a commitment and tools relevant to preventing mass unemployment, as well as tools providing for public employment in response to economic downturns. In addition, the right to work was incorporated in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, a proposal that was championed by Eleanor Roosevelt. It's also important to recognize that the notion of jobs for the unemployed has been more than just a policy vision. In the United States, we've not had an official policy declaring government as an employer of last resort, but there have been 3 periods during which the federal government has actually played quite a significant role in providing jobs for the unemployed. During the Great Depression, the Great Stagflation of the 1970s, and then again during the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. So having shown that the notion of jobs for all isn't new, I'll turn to my second main point, which is jobs for all can be considered deeply conservative. And I'd argue that today it's even more conservative than it was in the New Deal. In 1983, John Kenneth Galbraith, yet another institutional economist, looked back at the New Deal, and he argued that Roosevelt's revolution was conservative. According to Galbraith, the New Deal was, quote, intended to preserve the social tranquility and sense of belonging without which capitalism could not have survived and will not survive. So it was deeply conservative. It was attempting to preserve social tranquility. In my view, so it is today with the right to work as a progressive cause. In fact, today's challenge isn't merely to preserve social tranquility, but to restore it in many cases and to avert an irreversible ecological crisis. Now, in 2018, the New York Times published an essay by their columnist David Brooks on economic insecurity as it is experienced by American families and its strain on society. And in that essay, we find that Brooks, who's long considered, and certainly is in many respects, a conservative commentator, was grappling with issues that I would argue are rooted largely in economic problems that have been a concern of progressives and progressive economists in particular for decades. Now, Brooks's 2018 essay begins by citing research indicating that despite a robust macroeconomic boom or expansion, almost 2 out of 3 Americans were dissatisfied and anxious about their financial security, their social relationships, sense of purpose, and connectedness to community. So despite this macroeconomic expansion, we see 2 out of 3 people dissatisfied about financial issues and other issues relating to social relationships in the community. Then Brooks points to the gig economy and to the spread of other types of temporary and insecure jobs. And he links that insecurity to social unease and even to the nation's declining life expectancy. And he concludes that America faces a social crisis combined with widespread economic insecurity. Of course, I'd argue that none of what Brooks found is new or was new in 2018, except that perhaps many highly educated Americans have increasingly felt the economic strains that countless less educated Americans have experienced for decades. Writing in the 1990s, institutional economist Wallace Peterson argued that the US economy had been in a silent depression since the 1970s, a depression characterized by widespread stagnation and massive middle-class job loss. According to Peterson, economic life had for decades, again since the mid-1970s, battered the middle class and polarized society. In fact, the economic difficulties were so wrenching that Peterson anxiously, and I think we now could say presciently, saw these difficulties as, I'm quoting now, the raw material for a bitter, divisive conflict in America. And today, of course, that's what we see. We see the consequences of that bitter, divisive conflict in America all around us. So we have a long simmering economic crisis, which spawned a social crisis and political crisis. But it's also created a public health crisis, as suggested by Brooks' attention to falling life expectancy. As economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton have written in their book, Deaths of Despair, much of the growth of drug abuse, alcoholism, and suicide over the past several decades in the United States can be traced to the erosion of opportunities in the realm of employment and the erosion of economic conditions for workers, especially those with less than a college degree. Other public health experts agree, and they argue that employment is one of the key social determinants of health. And of course, the public health crisis is one that the current pandemic has only exacerbated. Now, economists of a progressive variety have been trying to draw attention to this silent depression and its human consequences, at least since the 1980s. And I think in particular the work of Barry Bluestone and Ben Harrison. So as with the economic crisis, the public health crisis isn't new. It's just more widespread and more widely recognized. The same is true of the global climate crisis. We've had ecological warning signs for decades, but policymakers have taken little action. And now numerous governmental and international reports stress that in order to avoid calamitous levels of planetary warming, nations have no time to lose to reduce carbon emissions substantially. So taken together, these current challenges suggest that pursuing jobs for all is arguably more conservative than it was in the New Deal. We need jobs, we need lots of them to address our economic, social, health, and climate crises, thus to avoid looming catastrophes that threaten not just industrial democracies, but all of humanity. So to be sure, all of this will cost money, require major institution building. It will entail huge administrative challenges, but the inaction is also costly, especially as temperatures rise globally and as automation threatens more and more jobs. So the notion of the right to work is not new, and pursuing jobs for all can actually be viewed as deeply conservative. My final point today is that establishing government as the employer of last resort is vital to fulfilling the promise of America. And now I get this phrase, the promise of America, from Barbara Jordan, former educator and American politician. During a commencement address in 1977, she used this term numerous times in her career, but in a commencement address in 1977 at Harvard University, she said that the people of America people of the United States want an America as good as its promise. But what is this promise? According to Jordan, the promise is the fashioning of a national community in which all of us have equal standing in the public forum, a community where we're all equal under the law and as participants in shaping policy. And she went further and she said that delivering on this promise places on government an obligation to act and to innovate. It's not just that government refrains from doing things to give us our freedom, but it has an obligation to act, and not only to act, but to innovate over time, which sounds very much like the notion that Commons had early on. So in a line reminiscence of both Franklin Roosevelt and John R. Commons, she argued that we must be willing, and I'm quoting now, we must be willing to adapt to changing circumstances, and that government must seek to remove those obstacles which would block individual achievement, including obstacles emanating from race, sex, and economic condition, end quote. The economic condition, joblessness. But where does the promise of America originate? I think, in my view, we find the origin of that in the US Constitution. And I saw that in particular when I was exposed to Barbara Jordan's presentation as part of the impeachment hearings of President Richard Nixon. And there she stated very famously, "My faith in the Constitution is whole, it's complete, it's total." So in particular, in the spirit of John R. Commons, I'd argue that America's promise is right there in the preamble. A fundamental reason for establishing the constitutional government of the United States is to secure the blessings of individual liberty for all and for our posterity, which means we need to be concerned with the ecological crisis, right? So combine that governmental aim with the aim of promoting the general welfare, and I think it's clear that the right to work is a vital part of fulfilling the promise of America. So to conclude, in my view, Barbara Jordan's notion of removing obstacles to the promise of America, that notion is fully in line with Commons' notion of an evolving web of rules that give liberty its meaning. And in that sense, we've come full circle on the need for the right to work. Now, no doubt it's better late than never when it comes to this right to work as a progressive cause. But I think we're running out of time, and I think I am too. So I'll stop here and say thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much for this extremely rich presentation. There's already so much on the table, but bear with us. We'll put more stuff on the table because we'll now continue with the next presentations. Next is Scott Ferguson. Is that? Yeah. Associate Professor at the University of South Florida in the Department of Humanities and Cultural Studies. And he's the co-director of the Film and Media Studies track there, and also a research scholar at the Binsgar Institute for Sustainable Prosperity and director of the Humanities Division of the Modern Money Network. And his book, Declarations of Dependence, Money, Aesthetics, and the Politics of Care was published by the University of Nebraska Press in 2018. So Scott, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the conference organizers and to my fellow panelists for putting all this together and joining me today. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully my PowerPoint, which has disappeared. Okay, so I think I'm gonna close this. Bear with me. This is what happened last time. I'm gonna reopen it and hopefully it will reappear.
It worked already, so
it did work once. It did. All right, so I think that should be working, and I'm going to begin the slideshow. We have gathered on this panel to envision new possibilities for participation, care, and the right to decent work as powerfully articulated by the demand for a federal job guarantee. As my contribution to this collective effort, I wish to rethink the nature of public funding, public work, and public art, as well as to forge novel connections between such spheres. To do so requires reviving forgotten histories of public funding, work, and art in order to stoke a contemporary political imagination impoverished by neoliberal ideology. Like several presenters at this conference, I approach these questions from the perspective of modern money theory or modern monetary theory, or just MMT for short. Heterodox school of political economy, MMT argues that money is not a private and finite token of exchange, as the modern liberal tradition would have us believe. Instead, MMT sees money as something like a boundless public utility, which, because it is limited by real resources and capacities, holds the promise to provision care for all. From this premise, MMT concludes that fiscal austerity is a political ruse and that we can always afford to take care of one another and the fragile planet we inhabit. The problem is that most governments choose not to support everyone and then, in blind deference to neoliberal orthodoxy, feign that their hands are tied. I should say that unlike other MMT-oriented presenters participating in this virtual gathering, I am neither an economist nor even a social scientist. I am a humanities scholar who specializes in the history of aesthetics and media culture. Thus, while I too draw upon MMT to explore possibilities for democratizing work, my primary project is to mobilize MMT's insights to critique faulty assumptions about money that have long structured critical work in humanities disciplines. Specifically, I aim to reground the study of aesthetics and media in MMT's emphatically public understanding of money. My argument is not merely that governments can afford to create a world in which aesthetic practices and media cultures thrive. More important, I insist that humanists need to rethink the history of aesthetics and mediation as one that is contingent upon a boundless public money form. From this vantage, the story of modern aesthetics, at least in the West, appears to be conditioned as much by fiscal ignorance, negligence, and violence as it is by positive efforts to cultivate aesthetic thought and practices. In fact, in my first published monograph, which seems to have disappeared, okay, that's all right. In fact, in my first published monograph, I appeal to MMT in an effort to reimagine the modern aesthetic project as a whole. My claim is that if we take MMT's arguments seriously and wish to actualize the shared care and prosperity it makes possible, we need to overcome the restrictive liberal assumptions upon which the modern Western aesthetic project was founded. As I see it, the trouble is that since at least the Enlightenment, aestheticians have set the aesthetic sphere against the monetary domain in an entrenched dialectical conflict. In my book, by contrast, I argue that aestheticians should embrace money as a boundless public utility, as well as affirm the fact that money is the primary medium upon which aesthetic practices depend. Going further, I argue that money itself is a kind of aesthetic medium. To put a finer point on it, money is what I call a proto-aesthetic instrument, in that it plays a central and always already prior role in cultivating the shared sensuous life in which specific aesthetic practices take shape. As part of this project, I consider the work of late 20th century feminist artist Muriel Latterman Euclid, which I contend can orient us today toward a more just reorganization of participation and care through a federal job guarantee. Euclid is known for making care work the focus of her artistic practice, inaugurating the important and increasingly global field of so-called social practice art that thrives to this day. Setting herself apart from her avant-garde and mostly male peers, Euclid named her practice maintenance art and sought to thematize and transform the invisible and often unpaid labor that sustains paid work and paid art alike. In doing so, Euclid not only politicized relations between aesthetic practice and social production, she also made what I am calling money's proto-aesthetic dimension the prime subject of her art. Euclid initiates her intervention into modern aesthetics with the 1969 text Manifesto for Maintenance Art. Structured as an outline, the manifesto sets forth a plan for an art exhibition that Euclid titled Care. Care for Euclid is not simply altruism or feminized labor. It is a collective eco-social problem or riddle that we can never eschew or escape. The following video clips are excerpts from her foundational manifesto, read aloud by Euclid a year later over a montage of images from her life's work.
Manifesto for Maintenance Art, 1969. Proposal for an exhibition, Care. Manifesto for Maintenance. B, two basic systems, development and maintenance. The sourdough of every revolution. After the revolution, who's going to pick up the garbage on Monday morning? Development, pure individual creation. The new, change, progress, advance, excitement. Maintenance, keep the dust off the pure individual creation, preserve the new, sustain the change, protect progress, defend and prolong the advance, renew the excitement. C, maintenance is a drag. It takes all the fucking time, literally. The mind boggles and chafes at the boredom. The culture confers lousy status on maintenance jobs equals low pay. Housewives equals no pay. Clean your desk, wash the dishes, clean the floor, wash your clothes, wash your toes, change the baby's diaper, finish the report, correct the typos, mend the fence, keep the customer happy, throw out the stinking garbage. Watch out, don't put things in your nose. What shall I wear? I have no socks. Pay your bills, don't litter, save string, wash your hair, change the sheets, go to the store. I'm out of perfume. Say it again, he doesn't understand. Seal it again, it leaks. Go to work, this art is dusty. Clear the table, call him again. Flush the toilet, stay young. E, the exhibition of maintenance art care would zero in on pure maintenance, exhibit it as contemporary art, and yield by utter opposition clarity of issues. Roman numeral 2, the maintenance art exhibition care. 3 parts, personal maintenance, general societal maintenance, and earth maintenance.
As her 1969 manifesto indicates, Euclid sought to transform maintenance into an aesthetic practice in its own right. She aimed to make the invisible background of maintenance perceptible, paid and not. Most of all, Euclid worked to politicize and transmogrify the social organization of care as a whole. At first, Euclid took on problems of household maintenance, documenting the feminized and mostly unremunerated labor of the household. Euclid managed both to affirm such care work and to criticize the unjust and gender division of labor upon which such social production depends. Next, Euclid turned to the material maintenance of the art object. In a series of performance works, she scrubbed, wiped, dusted, polished, and otherwise secured aesthetic artifacts put on display at a museum. With this, Euclid called attention to the care labor needed to maintain the art objects, but she also underscored the care work required to maintain the physical institutions and social spaces that exhibit art objects. Finally, Euclid set her eyes on collective maintenance as a broader social and ecological problem. In the late 1970s, Euclid began working as an artist in residence at the New York City Sanitation Department, a position she would hold for decades. Collaborating with sanitation workers on numerous projects, Euclid laid bare the aesthetic and political dimensions of waste management that are normally hidden from view. For the piece Touch Sanitation performance, for example, Euclid traveled through New York City's boroughs and personally introduced herself to all of the sanitation department's 8,500 workers on their beats. Over the course of 11 months, she greeted every sanitation worker with a handshake and the words, "Thank you for keeping New York City alive." She did so at a time encumbered by severe fiscal austerity, as a budding neoliberal order made New York City's sanitation department a flashpoint in a widespread struggle over social provisioning. As far as I know, Euclid is no MMTer, nor is she a self-conscious theorist of money. Still, I suggest that her artwork represents a deeply proto-aesthetic project. It offers fresh means for thinking creatively about money's potential to cultivate and transform the collective sensorium. For this reason, her aesthetic practice has a lot to teach us about the intersections between public funding, public works, and public art. Especially important, Euclid's work shows the folly of setting aesthetic practice against quotidian economic realities, as I argue in my book. Indeed, Euclid intimates as much in her 1969 manifesto.
Art. Everything I say is art is art. Everything I do is art is art. Quote, "We have no art. We try to do everything well." Balinese saying.
"We have no art. We try to do everything well," she quotes a Balinese saying. In this way, Euclid critiques liberal modernity's separation of everyday maintenance and aesthetic practice. By thwarting the dialectical opposition between money and aesthetics, Euclid manages to engage directly in money's pro-aesthetic field. As a result, her maintenance art renders money's invisible public backbone socially legible and politically mutable. Yet at the same time, I contend, it opens a new domain of thought where aesthetics and modern monetary theory meet. Maintenance art reconnects the aesthetic imagination to money's repressed proto-aesthetic capacities. Reciprocally, MMT implicitly expands these proto-aesthetic capacities by challenging the impoverished monetary imagination that gave rise to modern aesthetics. Thus, however unexpectedly, maintenance art and MMT converge upon a common proto-aesthetic project. I aim to make that project thinkable, suggesting new organizations of participation and care to be variously actualized through a rights-based federal job guarantee. On my view, such a project ought to critically reconceive the hegemonic categories of political economy and aesthetics that have historically bridled public imaginaries, while socializing anew historically classed, sexed, gendered, and racialized care labor in more just and creative ways. To do so, we must put on display still unknown histories of a boundless public money relation whose social potentials have been repressed and obscured. Only then can we hope to radically enlarge the contemporary political imagination surrounding public spending, work, and art. Only then can we imagine, make, and maintain the post-neoliberal reality we need. Hence, in summary, my contention is that, 1, if the modern aesthetic project is to have a viable future, it will have to transcend its dialectical antagonism with money. 2, an MMT-inspired practice of maintenance art directs us beyond this dialectic, since it expressly attunes aesthetic practice to the public money upon which eco-social care irrepressibly depends. And 3, as these arguments have hopefully begun to make evident, the humanities needs to play a part in reconceptualizing new possibilities for participation, care, and the right to decent work as we variously advocate and struggle for a federal job guarantee. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. Wonderful new dimensions opening up here. We'll leave the questions for later, and we now hand over to Alexander. Kolokotronis, I'm apologizing for pronouncing this probably wrong. He's a PhD candidate in political theory at Yale, focusing on participatory democracy and workers' self-management. And he's published in various popular venues, for example, Stanford Social Innovation Review. Prior to joining Yale, he worked in employee ownership advocacy for the New York network of worker cooperatives, and as a worker cooperative development assistant for Make the Road New York. And he's also on the advisory board of the Participatory Budgeting project. So Alexander, over to you. We look forward to your presentation.
Great, thank you. Let me just get my slides up. Okay. Apologies if you hear any. Is that visible to everyone?
Yes, it's full screen. Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So my presentation will be covering the very title of this, the question of administration of a jobs guarantee, and taking an approach around cooperative and participatory democratic designs. And I see there being a lot of potential for participatory democratic design for a jobs guarantee. And a lot of that is sort of latent in the way a jobs guarantee has already been presented in much of the literature. So for example, these are quotes taken from various articles. One being the national government pays the basic JG wage benefits package, but local governments and neighborhood associations administer the program. Local administration has a number of advantages over a centralized bureaucracy. Local communities know what needs to be prioritized, and local traditions will be sort of so on and so forth, upheld in doing so. So the presentation format is sort of course, here touching on key conference themes and theoretical framings around how a jobs guarantee can be democratized, but also facilitate democratized work. An overview of participatory budgeting, which I'll touch on more deeply in order to present such a design. And specifically looking at participatory budgeting at NYC and its potential and how that might help us visualize a jobs guarantee, and a sketch of a participatory process as applied to the jobs guarantee. So apologies for the barking in my background, if that is audible. So participatory democracy realizes various objectives of a jobs guarantee program. It serves a public purpose in that it's not just simply that the public purpose is being served through a jobs guarantee, but that people themselves are defining what that public purpose is. A public is being sort of initiated through deliberation, through decision making, and defining for itself what that purpose looks like in its very content. It opens up a broader policy-making structure. A jobs guarantee has often been framed as a way of addressing all sorts of problems across the spectrum and deepening our understanding of how to tackle different issues across the spectrum. Wasn't quite sure how to word this, but instead of people being simply, as is often framed, and critiques of the welfare state, rightfully or not, those critiques, of course, participatory democratic designs offer a way in which people are agents over welfare, over care, in the way similarly. This makes me think back to what Scott had just presented around maintenance art and our ways of being agents in that process, our ways of being agents in care. And then, of course, it's taking workers where they are and as they are. That's another principle which is often touched on for a jobs guarantee program, that through a program we're not simply saying, hey, this thing, you need to fit into this box, and that is how things will work. But rather that there are certain skill sets and knowledge bases across communities, and that can be worked with, and more than worked with, around which different jobs can be designed. And fifth, non-domination and transformation of work. As closely as possible, trying to not replicate a lot of the sort of dominating structures that exist within undemocratic workplaces, and instead using the jobs guarantee as a means by which we transform work and what work looks like and what work can be. So take a step back, and this will loop back around. We'll close the loop on how participatory budgeting can relate to a jobs guarantee. Participatory budgeting started in 1989 in Porto Alegre, Brazil. This statistic is outdated. It's no longer 3,000 cities. Some recent studies have shown 7,000 around the world. It's used in municipalities, academic departments, schools, universities. It's used at the state level. It's used at the national level, or minimally nationally facilitated processes have occurred in Bolivia and Dominican Republic and Peru, and Portugal actually carried out a national participatory budgeting process. So the reasoning for my bringing this up is that we can imagine, if we're talking about a jobs guarantee nationally, a scope through which we can see participatory processes also rolled out on a national basis. So what exactly is participatory budgeting? It's a process of democratic deliberation and decision-making in which ordinary people decide how to allocate typically a part, sometimes a whole, of a municipal or public budget. It allows members of a community to identify, discuss, and prioritize public spending projects, and gives them the power to make real decisions about how money is spent. There are various ways in which a participatory budgeting process can work, but this is how it occurs in New York City, and how this is also how it largely occurs across the United States, where residents come together and brainstorm ideas. They develop, they come up with ideas that are then sort of crowdsourced across multiple idea collection assemblies. And in the next phase, delegates, people who basically volunteer, develop some of those ideas into feasible projects. Some of those are narrowed down and then put onto a ballot, and residents vote. So that's open to, in some places, I think, people as young as 12 can vote in participatory budgeting processes. Then in schools, that could range from an entire school participating. So it's a way of engaging a sort of mass public to participate, even if people are not participating in the idea generation or the developing of the projects. At some point, this, in theory at least, touches everyone. And then the cycle repeats. In closer detail, there is some planning and preparation, of course. There are committees that come together to actually schedule these things out, determine spending guidelines, determine other guidelines. Again, there's the collecting of ideas through assemblies, could be online, otherwise, developing proposals, votes, and implementing and monitoring of projects. So typically PB is thought of through the lens of infrastructure projects, physical infrastructure. And in recent years in the United States, that has sort of expanded outwards. This has occurred again in other places. In Porto Alegre, there are thematic assemblies that have focused on arts, culture, and community. And here's an example of a ballot that was from a few years ago where a participatory budgeting ballot held these types of projects around theater arts, supports for a tenant union, creative engagement, tech, so on and so forth. So, and again, what we see here is support for a local cooperative. So just as a sort of inkling towards what this can look like for a jobs guarantee, we could imagine instead of a dollar assignment, we could see also potentially a jobs listing or number of jobs being listed under these buckets as well. And that being, again, sort of ironed out through very intensive understanding of what these different projects can look like that is crowdsourced from the community. Some other ideas as well, you'll see here, from robotics to race and equity to bystander interventions. This could range. So sketching out ideas for a local level administration. One, again, can imagine a sort of JG commissions being convened at the municipal and neighborhood level from nonprofits and community groups, and that those commissions are sketching out the boundaries of the process, the various logistical pieces. This idea of neighborhood resource teams is taken from Madison, Wisconsin, where a fairly progressive mayor had rolled out a program where workers from different public agencies would actually be out in the community and consistently interacting with residents and constituents. So we can imagine that also being a component of how these processes are being informed. And then, as I alluded to earlier, participatory budgeting as linked to not simply an allocation of a sort of abstract dollar amount, but actually as linked to an allocation of labor. And related to that, we can also imagine how these programs can be carried out and designed in a way that is more cooperative and more collaborative. Here's a further rundown around linking PB to a jobs guarantee in terms of, again, these proposals being sketched out through multi-stakeholder forms, being done at a citywide neighborhood. We could maybe even imagine metropolitan or regional levels. It depends how creative we want to imagine these things. If we're taking out, of course, the various sort of partisan lines that have to be dealt with in the United States currently, we can imagine tackling problems at a metropolitan or more regional basis that cuts across suburban and urban divides. I think this is maybe one of the biggest pieces in terms of rectifying inequality in the United States around urban-suburban divisions. But regardless of that, and in terms of theorizing this just writ large, these are the kinds of things that we can imagine, again, for a jobs guarantee in terms of administering it. We might also link other processes. We could imagine sortition processes where maybe it is a citizens assembly that's convened at the municipal or state level that is representative of the demographics and other thematics of a state or municipality that designs the process and designs specificities around the process, and goes from there and informs what a mini public, therefore informing what a mass public is making decisions around and what the boundaries of that process is. So there are a number of ways, there are a number of current and actually existing processes that we can draw on to design a jobs guarantee, which don't eliminate the role of the expert, not at all, as is shown here in sortition, but instead actually pairs the participation and informed decision-making and informed deliberation of mini publics, as well as of mass publics, to roll out a jobs guarantee that truly does meet workers where they're at, where they are, and engaging in cycles that further and continuously address the needs that are felt by a community. That wraps up my presentation, and I can be contacted at this email here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Great presentation. And now I hope we'll manage to hand over to Zdravka.
Hi,
Can
you hear
you?
me?
Yeah.
Yes, and I would like
Yes,
to
we can
share
hear you.
my
We
screen
can't
too.
see you.
First of all, thank you for a wonderful conference, and thank you to the organizers. I hope that right now you are seeing my screen.
No, we are not. Are you using the bottom at the? No. Or do others see it and it's just on my end? I don't see your screen.
I hope that now you are seeing it.
No, nothing seems to be happening. That's very strange. I was so happy to see you finally in the room, and now the presentation isn't there.
Well, I'm clicking the button, and the presentation is open, so I'm not sure as to why you are not seeing. I could talk without it, but there was some
You know
visual.
what? I can try to share it, and you just need to tell me to go from slide to slide.
Okay, well, okay, let's try that if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So I will be talking about unpaid work, job guarantee, and economy social provisioning. For some time, I have been spending time thinking about conceptualizing the economy as a social provisioning, and early around 2009 or so, also wrote on the connection between that and unpaid work and full employment and job guarantee. At that time, we called employer of last resort. So what I want to show is kind of the first graphic. It's a way, in the first slide, a way to start inquiry about what sort of jobs and why we need a job guarantee. And that has to do with understanding the multi-dimensional needs of people. And first of all, understanding that people kind of embodied agents and social creatures, as well as have a biological limitation, and they experience vulnerabilities and deprivations. So as we look at those needs, we also are looking at the deprivations that people are experiencing, while the economy is basically the provisioning of those needs. Of course, not everybody gets to have all of those. And so most importantly, those are provided, but by unpaid as well as paid work. And also, those are outside of work. In other words, we experience these capabilities, for example, of what people can do and be socially, also outside of work. We experience connections with others in nature at work and outside of work. And that work, of course, as I said, is paid and unpaid. And we generate belonging as well as being individuals in those work and non-work activities, and as well as our creativity, learning, and expressions and ability to discover things, very much experienced within and determined also by the conditions of work, both as unpaid and paid activity. And finally, of course, care is the kind of the fundamental of the overall economy, in a sense that we cannot even imagine the economy without care. There is no economy if there is no care. That's the kind of the fundamental either ability to have a security and livelihood, or alternatively not to have those. But of course, as a starting point, this is also a question of who is experiencing the deprivations of life and who lives through those deprivations and die. And that is also a starting point to think about what needs to be addressed that is not addressed in the for-profit production in the economy. Of course, this all is very much related to distribution as well as to oppressions, as obviously we see that we have learned how to tolerate and to use those vulnerabilities and deprivations, and how also some experience fully those the provision of those human needs. So how do we actually see those the more invisible deprivations, as well as how do we see what is actually provided as well as needed in the economy? If we can go to the next picture, one way to think about that is, first of all, recognizing that we have a number of processes, labor, care, recreation, consumption, for example, to take just a few, and those are interconnected, and we can look at those within each, let's say, institutions of households, community, and business enterprise, for example, and as well as others, and recognize the existence of paid and unpaid activities. For a second, I will leave aside the point that all of those are not just activities, but actual processes that are much more complex and involve other things such as symbols or norms or rules and regulations, expert discourse, and so forth. But to just talk about the activities, if we are thinking about these different activities as a paid is unpaid, we can see easily that they're experienced very differently depending on the socioeconomic status. And so for some leisure activities can involve, for some activities can be part of recreation and leisure, but also some households, for example, can experience quite a lot of intensive labor activities that is either paid or unpaid, that encroach quite a lot on those recreation activities. Furthermore, within each of these processes, there is some sort of unpaid labor. For example, if we even think about consumption, for some, consumption can take more labor exertion. For example, getting to a source of goods, or just providing for using time for commute and changing tasks and so forth between labor and providing care, consumption, and recreation. So we can see much vulnerabilities and identify needs that can be addressed. And so the importance here, of course, is how to identify those needs. As mentioned before, one aspect is to ask questions in terms of what we observe as phenomena. And another aspect, of course, is to actually involve people and broaden the opportunities for understanding those differences. So, for example, something that is probably not quite yet available is the experience within business enterprise and the presence of unpaid work even within the business enterprise. And I'm not talking only about unpaid work such as wage theft, and other practices, but also within the business concern that there is in fact a presence of care, for example, or other unpaid time that workers are applying, especially when it comes to emotional labor and so forth. So this is just quickly to think about ways of kind of dissecting each one of the activity within each one of the institutions, and to look at the differences that people experience in terms of their experience of work being paid or unpaid. This helps us to think about a job guarantee and work outside of profit. And to point out here is one point to be made about job guarantee is that only because it is paid, it doesn't mean that it is commodified. I think we have made this point already, that it's just the opposite. It's actually decommodifying the work experience, especially when we identify things that are sustaining the above needs, but at the same time are putting a lot of pressure on households and their different dimensions of their lives. So with this identifying of vulnerabilities, leisure and time and uncertainty about what the time for leisure, what the time for care would be, is very, of course, much related to the structure of our economy and to the changes in the way work is structured. And of course, I'm coming from an institutionalist perspective, and I'm using here Veblen's terminology, drudgery. The drudgery often is related very much to the most necessary work that is being done and the least valued. And of course, the ability to engage in workmanship or to feel that you are creating something and being rewarded or socially recognized is also unequally distributed or experienced in a ways. And so to the extent that there is a guarantee that first we are going to kind of transform the valuation of what is actually contributing to the economy, what is useful and providing these needs. Also, there is a kind of a shifting of thinking of what is actually waste in the economy. And so oftentimes we think about public expending as a waste. I mean, this is kind of one of the biggest political obstacle. But also we're not thinking that when we define those public expenditures that actually are improving, especially most vulnerable, marginalized group, we in fact are tolerating the oppressions and inequities that are less visible. And so what I'm pointing out here is the kind of way to make those more visible. So, of course, another aspect of the invisibility is when we are thinking about assigning more value. At the same time, we are revealing more value to care work or to unpaid work. We are revealing the invisible infrastructure that is not only domestic, but it's also global in terms of, for example, the global care chains, which can be seen also as a kind of invisible infrastructure support. So one thing, of course, is to rethink what infrastructure is, but also is to unveil the invisible infrastructure that exists within economies. In the form, for example, in terms of global care chains, and how to reform, how to basically, how job guarantee basically can contribute to moving away from this mode of social provisioning. And so I want also to point out that when we talk about unpaid versus paid, we don't want to assign necessarily that of the unpaid work, for example, within households or is it within community and so forth, that they are all associated with the positive and care and with supporting. There could be unpaid activities that are in fact part of oppressive processes or maintaining violence in communities and so forth. And so for this reason, when we are thinking about distinctions, or what I refer here to is invidious distinctions, so processes that are maintaining divisions and oppressions or dominance, this can happen also with the realm of unpaid activity. So when we're thinking about creating jobs, of course, it's not like a one-to-one. It's let's transform the unpaid activities, every unpaid activity, and to make it as a part of job guarantee. The point is to transcend kind of these relations of domination and exploit. So if we can go to the next picture, I can give you a quick visualization of what I have been, what I mean by the social provisioning economy, or the economy is a social provisioning. Social provisioning is not just kind of a social safety net, right? And it's not only the so-called care economy. It's the overall economy imagined in it's a kind of a natural and economic and so-called social processes. And this means to think about the economy obviously is interconnected, and to think about it in terms of being embedded and embodied in nature, and to think about the varieties of ways that people experience differences and oppressions in terms of processes rather than fixed category. But when we think about the economy, what I just talked about is care, labor, recreation, consumption processes. Of course, these are only part of what we are seeing in the economy. So I would just highlight here with respect to job guarantee, possibility to, in terms of identifying needs, and opportunities to create useful jobs that are not a part of a market. We can think about analyzing issues related to a process of mobility and residence. We can think about the effects of the machine process and the effect of that on people's time and restructuring of work. And how this makes it even more difficult for people to provide the needs that I was talking about. We also can think about investment in a broader terms, such as, for example, referring to an undertaking process, which encompasses investment for money, but also encompasses creation or mobilization of activities that contribute to the provisioning of needs, but they are not typical entrepreneurship, right? But they generate participation and so forth. So, of course, thinking about the lack of job guarantee is basically accepting that the economy is driven by threat and punishment, for unemployment, but also for being kind of disenfranchised also from other relations. And this, I'm not going to continue here. I have written more in detail elsewhere. But what the use for me of this is, of course, these are general these are general processes. And then when we have a specific context, we can use this thinking of interconnectedness and kind of evolution to identify issues or problems as well as opportunities to improve people's lives in terms of connecting the economic processes to the different social statuses. I will finish with the last slide.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to wrap up, please, so we have some time for discussion.
These are the kind of the theoretical underpinnings of all this, and I'm not going to spend time, but the main thing is that the things that I presented are moving beyond these kind of dualities that often come up, but also we recognizing the dichotomies in the provisioning, meaning that there is quite a lot of limitation of the so-called socialization of investment, or hoping that the market is going to provide for all those needs. The market cannot even provide for full employment as it is, let alone to provide for needs beyond production for profit. And so the final, I wanted to kind of read you a final kind of definition of job guarantees is a purpose. And I will finish with that. So that is basically a socially guaranteed commitment to maintain full employment independently of profitability through democratized public service jobs that recreate, sustain, and remediate community lives non-invidiously and help dismantle also oppressions. So I will stop with that, and if there is need for more details, maybe in the discussion.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all the speakers. We now have about 25, a bit less minutes for discussion, and I would like to ask all those who want to ask a question to put it in the Q&A tab. But there are no questions there at this point, so maybe we can start with giving the speakers the opportunity to react to each other's presentations. I mean, there were numerous threads and points of contact between these presentations, so maybe we could have a quick round of reactions, questions between our panelists. Charles, would you want to start?
Sure. Let's see here. No, I don't want to do that. Hang on. I just want to get back. There we go. Okay. So I was thinking as Zdravka was wrapping up about the U.S. experience with job creation, public job creation, and how that experience does have some connection to the three speakers that followed me. Scott talks about art as an important part of our social needs, and of course public employment should address that. And one of the things that we saw during the New Deal was that some of the public employment of the New Deal was directly addressed to providing for art, providing for plays, providing for murals and so forth. So there was an art dimension in that first of those three main periods of U.S. history when we saw public employment. In the second period, during the Great Stagflation, the era of CETA, right, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, there was an emphasis, an attempt, I should say, to emphasize community-based efforts, local efforts, and so then Alexander's remarks about participatory community-based endeavors, community-based budgeting. That would have, if done with a great deal of enthusiasm, would have really strengthened and shored up that era, and would have fit very nicely with that era, at least the stated aim of what was attempted in that period. And then Zdravka talks about care work, and that ties to the third era, the Great Recession period, when in addition to infrastructure projects and public works, we also saw a deliberate effort to address education and healthcare as part of public employment. So each of the speakers have said things that touch base with some of the actual lived experience of public employment in the United States, but also at the same time suggest that we need to do much more in each of these areas going forward with public employment.
Thank you very much. Scott, do you want to react to the other speakers?
Sure. I think obviously there's connections across all the papers. Maybe I will focus on Zdravka's work. I see a lot of commonalities between many of the things I'm trying to work through and what Zdravka's working through. I think what I think we're converging on, or one of the things I think we're converging on, is this necessity not just to work toward decommodification and demarketization, but also recognizing, I think as Zdravka said something like, there's no economy without care, right? And we have, there's a lot of care happening now, some good, a lot terrible, right? But care, as I think Euclid appreciates, is just always happening. It's just a question of how it's happening, how it's being arranged, who's doing it, who's being paid, who's not being paid. And so I think we're both converging on, another way to put it would be a total rejection of the notion of externalities, right? That it's all internal, right? And it's all provisioning. The question is it gonna happen through publicly provisioned private banks that then lend money to corporations that then provision jobs in narrow ways, or is it going to happen through fiscal expenditure and through various levels of political and social mediation, and how are those processes how are they going to play out as social processes, as aesthetic processes, as deliberative democratic processes, as Alex's work is pointing us to. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Alex.
Yeah, something I was thinking about as everyone was presenting is how everyone here has been drawing on how a lot of the elements of a sort of shared vision around moving forward. I mean, those things exist and are here right now, which Scott was just alluding to. And really, the question is how we are bringing those all together and how we're really surfacing them, and surfacing them towards that end. And so, I mean, it seems also to think a little bit more about what Scott was just saying, how decommodified and demarketized processes and forms are really essential to that, to bring those different elements together. So those are kind of the broad thoughts I had hearing everyone's presentation.
Thank you. Zdravka, do you also want to react?
Well, I think there are too many things. I think we are overflowing with ideas. I think some of the biggest challenges are that actually, while we may understand the complexities and the needs, the biggest challenge is that, in fact, others also understand that addressing those needs will contribute to actually people moving up, so to speak. And people simply don't like that. And I feel that this is the biggest struggle as to where, in fact, our economy is structured by vested interests and agency and capabilities of people who actually do not want to address the needs and deprivations of others. I mean, I think we all know that, and this is the biggest issue, in fact, to be addressed. And I think the scarcity of money framework and expert discourse and popular misguidance on that serves this purpose.
Thank you. Yeah, I was actually, I mean, I'm from Europe, so for me, there was quite a contrast between all of you speaking, and I was just imagining sort of the typical Trump voter, how they would react to this, and lots could be that said there, of course. But let's first move to two questions from Jilham Rai, which sound like well, the second one is definitely, I think, for Zdravka, and maybe the other one is for all of you. So the first is, do you think let me take the other one first. How to measure or evaluate unpaid work in developing countries where gender division is deep and household scores are not at all recognized? And the second, more general one is, do you think labor flexibility, which is demanded in countries in the developing world, can help decent work? Maybe we can start with Zdravka and the others can jump in if they want to add to it.
Well, I'm not sure if I can fully answer this here. I will say once again, the starting point is actually kind of almost a political struggle to recognize certain people, some people, varieties of different social stratas of people as having actually needs of doing things. And so, I mean, measuring presumes that, first of all, you are looking at those lives. And for this reason, of course, there are much attempts, for example, from feminist economics. There is much work, but the point is that what I want to point out is just even to consider the experiences of people, a kind of a broad kind of a system understanding of those processes that I talked about is a good starting point, and then applying to different social certifications of people is a good starting point to even begin exploring, so that then we go and measure. Like I said, I think a lot of unpaid work is not even considered as such, like, for example, in the context of the business enterprise, as I pointed out, and elsewhere.
Thank you. Do others want to come in? I mean, it's a very big and difficult question about flexible labor and the situation in developing countries.
I think also in previous sessions there were very good sessions explaining this very big tension, especially with the so-called flexible labor, which of course is the new liberal recommendation from economists, from the so-called new Keynesians, that in fact now we're living through that, right, because of technological change and so forth. And so I think that it's not only data through the time service, but I think actual almost like an oral history of people's experiences and talking about the way that do the platform work and how they manage leisure versus care versus work, and how those all intermingle. I mean, this all, there is a valuable in fact, the humanities can be part of this. What you are pointing, what you showed us, I mean, not many people want to go and expose their difficulties because we have a culture, we are strong and so forth. But I think that it's a very powerful to hear narratives and to put them up front because data, it's good. And this is data, by the way. Those narratives are data. That's what data is. We're not only looking at quantitative, right? There is no qualitative, quantitative. This is dualism, one of the dualisms that I talked about. But this data, popularly to be seen, how people are struggling, it's very powerful, I think.
Yeah, I saw this line once, the statistics are frozen tears, which is maybe a little bit melodramatic, but I think there is something to it. I wanted to come back to one point that Charles made, which actually raises a broader question to all of you, I guess, and all of us in a way. So you said that a job guarantee can be a conservative thing, a policy. And first, I thought you meant this critically, because some of my very left-wing colleagues would say, oh, it's the kind of thing that preserves capitalism, and in that sense, it's actually really bad, and we should aim for a completely different system. But I wasn't quite sure you meant it in that way. So the question that raised for me is, to what extent were you thinking about the possibility here of having a cross-party alliance in favor of that kind of policy? So who is it you would like to get on board there? And then, but also taking the sort of left-wing doubt into account, could there actually be a danger of sort of a version of that happening in a way that would keep us in a certain form of, suboptimal form of capitalism, without making even more fundamental changes that might actually be needed?
Well, I think we should try to bring everybody on board, right? And I would argue that what unites us is more important and is more important than what divides us. And so what I try to do is find the points where we are united, and then try to emphasize those and stress the points that I want to make by playing up the commonality between folks. I think when it comes to global warming, we're all in danger, right? When it comes to some of the social crises we have, we're all in danger when we think about the threat to democracy, and not just in the United States but elsewhere. Certainly some people might find that they benefit from that, but by and large, the vast majority of us are threatened. Hyman Minsky said that capitalism comes in as many varieties as Heinz has of pickles. So, there's no particular variety of capitalism that one needs to have. We can envision all sorts. There are already a variety of capitalisms, and we could even envision different ones. I don't know that talking about whether it's capitalism or not is even relevant. I just think that we should talk about what sort of a humane society we find is appropriate and is consistent with the U.S. Constitution in the case of folks in the U.S., right? That's what I like so much about Barbara Jordan, right? It was a unifying theme that says that we need to address people, and the government has an important role in allowing them to achieve their individual well-being, right? To blocking individual achievement is something that the government should be working to help circumvent. Right. So that's, I try to, you asked about the Trump voters early on. Well, sure. I think Trump voters are in large part disaffected because of those, several decades when neither party addressed the fact that we had economic erosion in the U.S. So I think, that's not everybody, but I think it's a lot of folks. So I think that yes, I'm aiming for certainly a progressive notion of employment, public employment, and of economic future. But I think that there are certainly many conservative dimensions to that in a meaningful way, and I think we need to emphasize that. One last thing, I was trying to find it, I can't. But on the side, I play jazz now and then, and came across an interview with Wynton Marsalis some years ago, where he was talking about there are two ways to approach jazz, and it's really two ways to approach life. Well, one way is where you are in competition with each other, and you feel that the only way you can get ahead is to bring other people down, right? And he says you can find a good deal of that in the music community and the jazz community. He said, but the other way is in a collaborative way where you realize that the way that you succeed is to help other people succeed as well. And that ultimately is the more meaningful and more enduring approach. And so when we were talking a few minutes back about the sort of push and pull here, I thought about that. And so I thought it was sort of appropriate that we can look, maybe this is my contribution to the arts a way of looking at this as opposed to the economic way of looking at this.
Thank you. Wonderful. There's a question from Pavlina, which I take it is also directed at you. She says, would you please talk about the distinction between fair work and workfare? Rob Skidelsky argues Orban's work requirement for unemployed policy is an illustration of the job guarantee. I strongly disagree. Your take? So I guess maybe first Charles and then the others if they want to jump in.
Workfare is, deliberately an attempt to be punitive, right? And we're not looking for that. We're looking at employment as a way to enable people to achieve not only economic security, but also the many other things that come from employment and from doing decent and constructive socially beneficial work. So fair work, in my mind, is very different from workfare. I mean, workfare, you would I guess in the extreme, you would have folks doing the same sort of work that punitive work that penal labor that prison laborers do. I mean, and you say, well, if you want to be able to support your family, then you must do that. That's just crazy, and it's not socially constructive. There is so much that's constructive and valuable that needs to be done in the area of care, dealing with opioid crisis, dealing with the environmental crisis, dealing with other social crises, education. Well, we don't have time for punitive employment.
Thank you.
Can I chime in? That's why I pointed out that our economy is almost structured on a process of threat and punishment currently, and not only because people are afraid that they will not access decent jobs, but also because we have this habit of implementing means-tested programs, or at least advocating those, and this is a mindset of scarcity, as they say, right? And it's also part of the punitive threat and punishment economy. In fact, the job guarantee, I see it is a way where people can run to, in a way, if they have to escape an oppressive situation. Is it within a household or even within work? You can have a higher pay of work that is full with bullies, and you may, in fact, go to a lower pay work. Like I said, money is one part of human lives, and people are not just workers, consumer, taxpayers, but they want to have whole lives. And I think this is kind of also the biggest fear, is that in fact we want as society as if to have a threat and punishment in our economy.
Scott also had his hand up, yeah?
Yeah, I want to piggyback on everything that's been said, and I fully agree with, and say that conceptually, rhetorically, socially, aesthetically, framing the job guarantee is something I've spent a lot of time working through and thinking about. And I think while it is often conceived as a targeted program for a particular population of un- and underemployed, I think there's a danger in stopping there in our framing, because it's precisely a systemic transformation that changes the tenor of life for everybody in a variety of ways, that can lead to not not more neoliberal punishment and flex labor, but a new kind of flexibility that allows, young people to pick up, go explore, go to another city and get a job there for a while, right?
And rich people's kids already do, but
yeah, but letting everybody do it, and I think, I tend to think in terms of the job guarantee society, creating a job guarantee society. I think we have that rich metaphor that we use often. It creates a wage and benefits floor. But what a floor does is it supports everybody, right? And it just changes the tenor of everything. And my kind of counter term to the job guarantee society is what we want to avoid is a job guarantee ghetto, whether it's an imaginative one or it's a structural one where we create a targeted program for those atomized people, and we just deal with them, and we're not really thinking about an integrated dynamic transformation that would include community participatory budgeting, as Alex points out, that would include, transforming all these care relationships that Zdravka is talking about, etc.
We're almost out of time, but I would like to address a last question to Alexander, because we're already getting there now. To what extent or what kind of deliberative practices could help ensure that a job guarantee would not be these bad things, like turn into a ghetto policy, turn into a sort of enforced mechanism, but actually really be that liberating tool that would help to transform society? Would you have specific recommendations maybe over what deliberative strategies to use here? Okay, now we lost you apparently. No, you're back. Good.
I was barking again. So the question was what deliberative strategies to sort of get there?
How could we use deliberative strategies, or which deliberative strategies, to get to the positive vision of a job guarantee and not the negative possibilities that have just been mentioned?
I think so. I think one of the great things that has been happening in deliberative democratic circles has been showcasing how deliberative democracy transforms participants into becoming very informed citizens, informed people, informed members of a political body or body politic, and as applied to a range of issues, as applied to issues of as wide-ranging as medical diagnostics in a hospital to nuclear policy. This has time and again been shown that ordinary people, members of society, can participate and make policy around very complex subjects. And so I think that showcases in itself that why shouldn't people be participating in designing jobs in their very community, in participating in fora where they are together exchanging ideas and exchanging their own knowledge bases around designing jobs. And so I think in the same way that translates into designing jobs themselves, in terms of, and this goes back a little bit to the labor flexibility question as well. How might jobs be redesigned when we're talking about different areas of work? There are certain assumptions we might be coming in with. There are certain assumptions that industry experts might be coming in with in terms of what a job should look like in whatever specific area we might think of. And so I think a key way of sort of ensuring that we define fair work as actually being fair work is by involving people in doing just that, as rooted in their own communities. So I think I think there are a lot of really, really specific ways that can be done, but I think broadly that's what it looks like.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I also apologize to people who've just also added more stuff in the chat and Q&A box. But as you know, on this platform, you can connect to each other. Thank you very much for these great presentations and discussions. And I hope we can continue these issues and maybe contribute to real change, hopefully. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.